Hey everyone, coming at you again with another Thursday lesson. And as I said last week, we are continuing doing our Bible study through the Gospel according to Matthew. And this week we are going through chapter 8, verses 18 through 27. Now, a little bit of this is continuing the themes of last week. So if you haven't done that, just go and check out last week. It's either, if you're on the website, it's in the video right below this one. If you're watching this on YouTube, just go into our videos and find it. So let's read it real quick. Matthew 8, verses 18 through 27. Now when Jesus saw a great crowd around him, he gave orders to go to the other side. A scribe then approached and said, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." And Jesus said to him, "Foxes have holes, and the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." Another of his disciples said to him, "Lord, first let me go and bury my father." But Jesus said to him, "Follow me and let the dead bury their own dead." And when he got into the boat, his disciples followed him. A windstorm arose on the sea, so great that the boat was being swamped by the waves, but he was asleep. And they went and woke him up, saying, "Lord, save us, we are perishing." And he said to him, "Why are you afraid, you of little faith?" Then he got up and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a dead calm. They were amazed, saying, "What sort of man is this, that even the winds and the sea obey him?" So like I said last week, we're continuing at least one of the themes from the previous three stories of healings, but we're also introducing a new theme here as well, which is this is all about kind of faith and hardship in the midst of discipleship. And the theme that what we talked about last week was Jesus' authority and the importance of finding authority in Christ. And in this case, especially with our second scripture where Jesus has the authority over nature and creation itself. He doesn't just have authority to cast out demons or to heal illnesses, but he can actually command the seas and the waves to be still. But let's focus mostly on the aspect of discipleship. This isn't just, two independent stories of each other. We learn something very interesting about discipleship here. So let's just start with the first kind of passage, which is two disciples claiming they will follow Jesus. First a scribe and then an unnamed disciple. The first one says, "I promise I will go and follow you wherever it is you lead." And then the second one says, "Lord, I will follow you, but first let me bury my parents." Now the first one, Jesus gives an interesting warning, which is foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. In other words, if you're willing to follow me wherever it is I go, prepare to be homeless. Prepared to have nowhere to call home. Prepared to have nowhere that you can find genuine true rest in, because the calling of following me is one of giving up absolutely everything that you hold dear to you. In the second one, a very kind of unusual one where he says he'll follow, but only if he's allowed to go bury his parents. Jesus says, no, leave them behind. Let the dead bury their own dead. Now, we're not sure what Jesus exactly means by this, because this is such an odd thing. The kind of burial rite of a child burying their parents was a very, very, very important rite in Judaism. So why is Jesus telling them to not do it? Well, the answer to that is because we are required to face both sacrifice and hardship if we're going to be disciples of Jesus. Believe it or not, discipleship has a pretty heavy cost. The Bonhoeffer quote is always a good one to remind yourself, which is, when Christ calls a man, he beckons him to come and die. In other words, there is going to be this total changeover in your life. Everything that meant something to you before, you're going to be asked to sacrifice it. You're going to be asked to, in a sense, give it up. And you're going to be asked to change. And now Jesus doesn't do this just because he likes sacrifice, but there's two reasons. One is that we will always have things that we want to hold on to that keep us away from being able to fully be discipled. We are very attached to this world, and we're very attached to worldly ways of living. We like our things, we like our way of life, we like being comfortable. And we don't like the idea that to participate in a religion, we may have to give up being comfortable. We don't want to be like the Son of Man who has nowhere to lay his head. We don't want to be like the disciple who isn't allowed to bury their parents because Jesus requires that, we must follow him even over our own family. Now, these are really big calls, and I just want to say, I don't think every single one of these is necessarily true of every single person. Not everyone is going to be called by God to be homeless, and not everyone is going to be told not to bury your parents. But what Jesus is trying to show here is, what is your priority? What is your priority in this life? Is your priority being comfortable? Is your priority your family over anything else? Is your priority to avoid hardship at all costs? And if that's your priority, then following Jesus is going to be very, very difficult, if not impossible. Another passage, which I'm not sure if we've gotten to yet, where he says, it's easier for a rich man to enter through the eye of a needle than to get into the kingdom of heaven. In other words, there's, and in that case, it's talking about those who love money and love possessions. You're going to have to give up that love of those things. But ultimately here, Jesus is showing us hardship is a requirement of discipleship. Hardship builds us up. Hardship sets our mind on the proper priorities and our proper meanings for life and for existence. And it purifies us in a sense. If we've let go of earthly attachments, if we've let go of the things that make us comfortable as a sacrifice offering to God and a willingness to do whatever he leads and to genuinely go wherever he says to go, we are going to learn something about God. We're going to have our hearts purified because we're dedicating ourselves. We're becoming that living sacrifice, as Paul says, in the pursuit of obedience and in the pursuit of following God. Now, what do we do when we face these hardships? If we have to have hardship, how do we handle these difficulties? How do we handle these sufferings? And that brings us to the second passage, which is Jesus calming the storm. This isn't just a story solely about Jesus' authority, but it's also a story about what we have to go through in order to be discipled. It's about, and ultimately the answer is that we will have these moments where it will feel like there's this giant storm around us, where we're in this tiny boat on the sea and the waves are coming over the boat, and it feels like God is asleep, nowhere to be found. He's not fixing our problems for us. We're left alone out to sea. And what are we to do? Now, and we may even have moments where we're saying what the disciples say, which is, Lord, save us. We are perishing. Once again, sometimes discipleship feels like we are perishing because God is stripping us and purifying us from our old sinful selves, purifying us from the death of our lives and bringing us into new life through faith. And then Jesus wakes up and he's not exactly pleased with it, and he says, why are you afraid, you of little faith? Now he fixes the problem for him, and just like many times when we cry out to God, when he is wanting us to face these hardships, he's wanting us to have faith, but God is gracious and loving, and he will at times rescue us even in these moments we're supposed to have faith. But the answer is the faith in the midst of this hardship that we deal with. We will deal with difficulty in the midst of hardship, in the midst of discipleship that will at times manifest in a great storm, and that we will have fear. But no matter what the cost is, what we are called to embrace, even in the midst of this violent storm, is faith and obedience in Christ. When we combine these two stories together, what we get is this look and this model for following Christ is based upon faithfulness and faith and obedience. That we are called to obey Christ even when he calls us to do things we don't want to do, even when he calls us into things that seem absurd and ridiculous, and maybe even problematic to a degree. But as we go, and things that will, by the way, lead to hardship and pain and difficulty. But as we do it, we are called to have faith in the one who has the ability to calm even the winds and the sea, the one who can, that creation itself obeys. And so this leads us to a few questions. What is Jesus calling us to sacrifice in order for us to follow him? First of all, are we willing to say, Jesus, wherever you tell us to go, we will go? That's an important one. That should be our mentality, but it oftentimes isn't. Even mine. There are definitely times where I definitely know for sure God wanted me to do something, and he said, get ready to sacrifice, and I didn't want to sacrifice it. God didn't stop loving me. God didn't say I'm no longer a Christian, but I didn't get to inherit the beauty of whatever that work was going to be. But we should all begin to start to tiptoe and baby step into this mentality. Maybe we don't have to give up everything at first, but we should be working towards a place in our heart and our spirit to where we are willing to say, Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go. Whether it takes me to wherever it takes me, no matter the hardship, I am willing to follow. And when we ask Jesus this question, Lord, I am willing to do whatever it is you are calling me into, what is Christ going to ask us to sacrifice in the process? Are we going to be asked to sacrifice our comfortability? Are we going to be really willing to sacrifice our priorities? And it's to be aware, Jesus is an anti-family here. He's just pro-Jesus here. He's not saying it's bad to have family and be attached and care for them. By the contrary, we're supposed to if we're good Christians. But what he's saying is even when we care for family, Jesus always comes first. The calling of God and the seeking of the kingdom of heaven is always our number one priority in all things. And there will be times where the two contradict each other, where we will have to choose certain things and what we're going to choose. So what is God calling you to choose between? What is standing in opposition in your life to following the calling of Jesus? This is a difficult question to ask, and it takes a lot of prayer to find out, but this should be something incorporated in your prayer life. God, what are you calling me to sacrifice? God, what is, the thing that what is my crutch in comfortability? What is it I am putting over you priority-wise, and what do I need to give up in order to follow you? And then when we get in the midst of the hardship, when we're in our own storms, are we creating in our hearts a heart of faith that doesn't think we're perishing, that doesn't see the situation as one where God's going to let us die in the midst of? God wouldn't command us to go across the sea if he knew we would just going to die. The martyrs being an exception, but there's not too many of them, especially in America. In fact, I would say there are none in the West right now. But God's not going to let us die. And so what is our mentality when hardship happens? Are we having a mentality that God is failing us, that God is going to let us die, and that we shouldn't trust him or follow him because of it? Or are we going to have faith? Are we going to have the mindset that we've been called by God to do something, and we are going to do it? We've been called into discipleship. We've sacrificed what is holding us back from the presence of God, what's holding us back from entering into the kingdom. Now am I going to have the faith to go forward and accomplish what the Lord has called me into? Or am I going to be scared and unafraid and flee in fear of my own death? I've met so many people in ministry who are able to do the first, but when that storm happens, they back out. They sacrifice a lot up front, but they don't realize that discipleship, there's difficulty with it. It's not just sacrifice, but to obey God is very hard at times. Sometimes it's very easy, and luckily God tends to not just drop us in the ocean in a violent storm. A lot of times He walks us through small struggle after small struggle, but oftentimes that small struggle in the beginning feels like a big storm. So I don't want to scare you with this, but I have met many people that back out at this point. They say, "Lord, save us, we're perishing." And God doesn't immediately fix the situation, and so they end up not following God anymore, or at the very least they're much more careful. They're much more protective of themselves and their lives. And so this is a question we need to ask ourselves. Do we have the faith that blames God or thinks God is letting us die in these hardships of discipleship? So, two important questions. Do we have a discipleship that is actually creating hardship? If this is easy, we're probably not doing it right. God doesn't command only the easy parts of us. He commands our entire hearts. And because we're sinful and God requires us to sacrifice things that keep us away from Him, all that's very difficult. So are we being discipled in a way that is creating genuine hardship in our life? And if it's not, we need to ask ourselves what it is we need to give up, what it is we need to change, what it is we need to ask God what He is compelling us towards, because it just will result in hardship. It won't necessarily, be these crazy ascetical practices, but it will be difficult. We do have to sacrifice. The love of neighbor is not easy, especially if your neighbor is not a particularly nice person. That's hardship. That's sacrifice. Trusting God in the midst of painful difficulties in life is not easy. That's a hardship, but we're called to regardless. So is our discipleship hard? If not, we should probably ask God what it is we need to sacrifice and do. And do we have faith in the midst of hardship? Do we trust that God is going to get us through to the end result, even if we don't know what that end result is? So hopefully this Bible study has been a little bit edifying to you. I know it's a hard subject and it's not a fun thing to say. Things are hard, but the goodness is that we do have the God who commands the sea and the wind, who commands creation itself, and who loves us deeply and intimately and will not fail us. And if we think He's failed us, we're probably misunderstanding what God has called us to do, or we may have done something that God didn't command us to do in the first place. And so luckily we have a God who is defined by His love for us. He doesn't give us more than we can handle. He doesn't call us out of things that are good. He only calls us out of things that are bad for us. And if something is, sometimes things are good for us, but we're pursuing it in a sinful way. And so that's temporarily taken away from us. And then God gives us back that thing when it becomes good. And I'm rambling now, I'm sorry. But this isn't a fun subject, but it's a good subject. Hardship is purifying. Hardship does build us up. Nothing that is worth gaining is easy to get. Everything worth having is worth the work. Everything worth having is worth sacrificing for. The word passion means to suffer for. And if we're going to be passionate about Jesus, we got to ask ourselves, are we willing to suffer for it? And are we suffering for it? And are we willing to suffer more for it? And by the way, compassion means to suffer with. So if we're trying to have compassion over somebody, we're suffering with somebody. But we'll get to that at another time maybe. Am I willing to suffer for it? Am I actually passionate about discipleship? Or am I okay with just living comfortably and not following Jesus wherever He goes? Obviously, I think we should become passionate about Jesus and be willing to suffer and embrace discipleship, because the end result is the loving, caring, peaceful presence of God and the walking in His kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. So ask yourself a few of these questions. Pray about it. Ask God what it is that's keeping you away from embracing His kingdom, from going wherever He calls you. And then gently patiently begin sacrificing bit by bit. Maybe you can't do it all at once, just do a little bit. But begin bit by bit making little sacrifices for God and stepping out in faith in little ways. And if you do this patiently, carefully, and full of faith, you'll be surprised where you find Jesus and where God is willing to take you.